I knew the situation had officially gone too far the moment I walked out to my field before sunrise and saw tire tracks cutting straight through freshly planted ground that had taken me 2 full days to prepare and sitting right in the middle of it. Like she owned the entire farm was Karen's black SUV parked beside my irrigation equipment while she casually walked her dog, like nothing was wrong. At first, I honestly just stood there staring because this was not some empty dirt lot. This was active farmland, and every hour mattered during planting season. But somehow this woman kept acting like my property was her personal shortcut parking area and private park, all at the same time. The craziest part was that this had already happened. Before, not once, not twice, but multiple times over the past month, and every single time she had some new excuse. One day she claimed she only stopped for a minute. Another time she said the grass looked public. Then she started insisting the land was not being used properly, so parking there should not matter. That one almost made me laugh because anybody with eyes could see active equipment fencing crops and work markers all over the place. But somehow she convinced herself none of it applied. To her, I walked toward her calmly, trying hard not to lose my temper because getting angry never helps with people like that. And I told her directly, "This is private property. You cannot keep driving onto my farm and parking here." She looked at me, like I was bothering her, and actually rolled her eyes before saying, "Relax, it is just land. Nobody is using this corner anyway. Nobody using it." Meanwhile, my equipment sat 10 feet away and half the soil underneath her tires was ruined from the weight of the SUV pressing into fresh irrigation lines. Before this story gets even crazier, make sure you like this video and subscribe to Karen Stories Daily because what happened after this turned into the biggest neighborhood drama this county had seen in years. I told her again firmly that she needed to move the SUV immediately and stop coming onto the property completely. And instead of apologizing, she crossed her arms and said, "Maybe if your farm looked less abandoned, people would know." It was private. That sentence right there told me everything. This was not confusion. This was entitlement, and somehow she genuinely believed she could do whatever she wanted because nobody had seriously stopped her before. The worst part was that several nearby neighbors had already warned me about her before all this started. They said she constantly pushed boundaries, complained about everyone, and treated rules like optional suggestions, especially when she thought she could intimidate people into backing down. I should have listened more carefully, because over the next 2 weeks things got even worse. She started parking there almost every weekend, sometimes staying for hours while walking trails near the creek behind my property, and every time I confronted her, she acted offended, like I was harassing her for asking her not to trespass on private land. I installed larger, no trespassing signs. She ignored them. I placed barriers near the side entrance. She drove around them. I even contacted local authorities once, and she somehow convinced them she had accidentally taken a wrong turn while exploring nearby roads, accidentally 3 weekends in a row. At that point, it became obvious she was doing it intentionally because she thought there would never be real consequences. Then came the morning that changed everything. I had workers arriving early to move equipment across the lower field, and when I headed down there with my tractor, I saw her SUV parked directly in front of one of the equipment paths, making it impossible to pass through safely, and she was nowhere around. No note, no phone number, nothing. Just her vehicle blocking active farm operations again. My workers stood there waiting while I tried calling local towing companies. But because of the muddy terrain near the field, none of them wanted to risk bringing standard tow trucks onto the property before conditions dried out. Hours were passing, work was delayed, and honestly, I was tired of my entire schedule being controlled by someone who clearly had zero respect for boundaries. That was when one of my workers jokingly looked at the tractor and said, "Honestly, that machine could probably lift the whole SUV if it had to." Everybody laughed for a second, but then I looked at the heavy lift rig attached to the tractor and an idea started forming in my head. Not reckless, not destructive, but enough to finally make a point she would never forget. So instead of damaging the SUV or touching it carelessly, we carefully used lifting straps and the tractor to move the vehicle completely off the work path and suspend it safely several feet above the muddy ground beside a giant oak tree near the edge of the property, where it could not block anything anymore and where absolutely nobody could miss seeing it. The SUV was perfectly secure, untouched, undamaged, and impossible to ignore. Honestly, the sight looked unreal. Her expensive black SUV hanging safely in the air beside that massive tree while farm workers stood nearby staring at it in disbelief looked like something straight out of a movie. About an hour later, Karen finally came walking back toward the field holding an iced coffee, smiling casually until she looked up and saw her SUV hanging there. She froze. Instantly, the cup literally slipped out of her hand and hit the dirt. For a few seconds, she could not even speak. She just stared at the vehicle swinging slightly in the breeze before finally screaming, "What did you do to my car?" And that was only the beginning of the chaos, because within the next hour, deputies, neighbors, and half the county were suddenly involved in a situation nobody was ever going to forget. When deputies arrived, the first thing they did was stare up at the SUV hanging beside the tree because honestly it looked so unbelievable nobody knew how to react at first, and even some of the officers were trying not to laugh while Karen shouted that I had destroyed her vehicle and demanded I be arrested immediately. But once everything was explained, the situation started shifting very quickly. I showed deputies the repeated trespassing reports, photos of tire damage across planted areas, security footage of her driving around barriers, and multiple warnings telling her to stay off the property, and suddenly the story looked very different from the dramatic version she was trying to tell. The deputies inspected the SUV carefully and confirmed there was no visible damage because we had moved it slowly using proper lifting straps and secured it safely away from active equipment paths. Karen kept yelling that nobody had the right to touch her vehicle, but one deputy finally asked the question everybody there was already thinking: why was your SUV parked in the middle of active private farmland? Again, after repeated warnings that shut her up for a second. Then several workers explained how her vehicle blocked scheduled farm operations, causing delays and creating safety problems. And by that point, even nearby neighbors who gathered along the road started speaking up about how often she ignored property boundaries around the area. Honestly, you could see the moment Karen realized public opinion had completely turned against her. The deputies eventually ordered the SUV lowered safely back to the ground, and before leaving, one officer warned her directly that future trespassing complaints could lead to actual charges if she continued ignoring property lines. After that day, she never parked on my farm again. Not once, and the story spread across the county so fast that for weeks people kept slowing down near the road hoping to see the famous tree where the SUV had once been hanging in the air. What stayed with me most was how someone can ignore polite warnings over and over until embarrassment finally becomes the only thing strong enough to stop them. If you made it this far, let me know what you would have done in this situation and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And do not forget to subscribe to Karen Stories Daily for more crazy stories where entitlement eventually meets reality.